Hello, I'm Tom Harper.
And I'm Diana Thomas,
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show.
a podcast about the historical, geographical, natural, and human background to the world of Wilbur Smith.
From the stern tower of the Breath of Horus, I watched the pantomime of human frailty that was being played out below me. Traditionally, the populace is allowed to eat its fill of the meats of the hunt upon the foreshore, just as long as none of the spoils are carried away. Living, as we do, in a verdant land, which is fertilized and watered by the great river, our people are well fed. However, the staple diet of the poorer classes is grain, and months may pass between their last mouthful of meat and the next. Added to which, the festival was a time when all the normal restraints of everyday life were thrust aside. There was license to excess in all things of the body, in food and drink and carnal passion. There would be sore bellies and aching heads, and matrimonial recriminations on the morrow. But this was the first day of the festival, and there was no check on any appetite.
Now, that was a reading from River God, Wilbur Smith's epic novel set in ancient Egypt, in which the hero, Taita, is describing the aftermath of a hippo hunt. In our last episode, we discussed the Hyksos and the historical background to River God with our special guest, Professor Joann Fletcher, Honorary Visiting Professor of Archaeology at the University of York. And I'm delighted to say that Joann has agreed to join us again to tell us more about life in ancient Egypt. Joann, welcome back.
Lovely to be here.
Now, in that passage that Tom read so brilliantly, Taita observes that the Egyptian people, thanks to the Nile, are remarkably well fed. I'm just out of curiosity, how kind of good was the life of the average Egyptian? Were they, as it were, like peasants in medieval times?
I think it depends on who we're comparing the ancient Egyptians to. Certainly, when you compare them to the average citizen of Greece or Rome, life was much, much better in Egypt. The weather was consistently better. Crops grew with far less effort. I mean, you still, obviously, it's back-breaking toil, but you know that if you plant that crop, the River Nile's there. It's going to get watered. You know, you've got your irrigation system there. You know what's happening. The sun will shine. The crops will grow. So obviously, sometimes if the Nile was particularly low, there would be famine. The Nile was too high, there would be floods. Floods far more extensive than normal. And so obviously there were problems in life. But in terms of the day-to-day life of working people, it does seem far preferable to certainly life in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and in medieval Britain, I would have said, where, let's face it, so much of the time it would have been rain, it would have been cold. It was a miserable existence. At least in Egypt, there were some perks, and while the average person would have been existing on a diet of largely bread, as
Sure.
lots of people still do today. It's the staple food in Egypt, always has been, supplemented by vegetables and fruit. There were always fish from the Nile. You could go hunting in the desert to catch wildlife. And at the religious ceremonies, of which there were quite a few, public festivals were there when people got to eat beef and meat and so forth. And so while it wouldn't have been beer and Skittles every day, it would have still been far, far better. If I had to go back in time to any of these places, I would much prefer to have gone back to ancient Egypt than pretty much anywhere else until relatively recently in our own culture. And you know, don't get me started on women and how they were treated back then and now. You know, it's interesting. It's interesting for sure.
Um, we've been talking about the kind of the ordinary people. I'd quite like to jump back to the royals because in Rivergard, our protagonists are very much the nobles and the royal family.
Snob.
And I was really intrigued again by sort of the historical parallels to what Will was writing about. So again, I'm going to mispronounce all these names, but Salitis, the Hyksos king, um, he appears in the novel at the head of this army of chariots, and he is a historical person, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the problem with the Hyksos is we're not just we know they existed, but we're looking at them through a Greek lens, because when the Greeks conquered Egypt under Alexander the Great, 332 BC, he established 3 centuries of Greek rule over Egypt, the Ptolemies, the dynasty of Cleopatra. And the great thing about that is that the Ptolemies
Yeah.
brought in this wonderful idea of studying Egypt's much more ancient past. They took on a huge number of scribes, scholars, researchers to translate any and every ancient Egyptian text they could find, translate it into Greek for them to better understand. And it's this Greek information that's come down to us, which is why a lot of the names we have for Egyptian characters have Greek endings or a Greek form. As I said at the beginning of this, like Hyksos is really the Greek version of Hekahasut, and so are the names of some of the Hyksos, Salitis, Apophis, like Egyptian pharaohs, Tutmosis, Amenophis. Slight twist on the ancient Egyptian originals. And also, it's notoriously difficult sometimes to fully clarify exactly what was going on under the Hyksos, because post Hyksos, the Egyptians themselves did try and remove all trace of a lot of the things that the Hyksos themselves had done in their country. So you're looking at all this information being processed by Greek minds in the last few centuries BC of something that happened over 1,000 years earlier. And we in turn are looking at what the Greeks are saying about this. So
Yeah.
that's why it's all so bitty, if you like, and so difficult. And that's why every few years, with new
Mm.
discoveries in Egypt, we're finding even pharaohs we'd never heard of before. Only a few years ago, the Americans discovered a completely new Egyptian pharaoh at Abydos, who'd been around in the Second Intermediate Period during the so-called Hyksos period. We didn't know anything about this person. So again, we've got to sort of extend our knowledge of king lists and who was there, what they were called, did they exist in reality, are they a figment of later imagination? So it's by no means clear, and the Hyksos period is notorious for being a little tricky to negotiate, shall we say. But from a novelist point of view, that's fabulous. A lot of artistic license is possible.
Yeah, I was going to say, it makes it ideal territory for a novel. Um, Obviously, as the novel opens, we're in the reign of someone who Wilbur describes as Pharaoh Memosi, who I noticed does not appear on any king list that you give.
Not yet, but it might do one day.
Well, yeah. Maybe Wilbur's just got that channel to the afterlife, and he's not found yet. But there's someone called Sekenra. I don't know if I pronounced that
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Who seems to have died a violent death at around this time. What can
yeah.
you tell us about Sekenra?
Oh, absolute giant of Egyptian history. I absolutely love Sekenra. He was the Theban local ruler who led the fight back, really. Him and his sister Ahotep, his sister wife. So Sekenra and Ahotep, um, very, very strong military leaders, both of them, male and female. And Sekenra was an amazing character, and we know so much about him because his body was preserved. You can look at him today in Cairo Museum. You can see him face to face, and you can get a real idea of this hero who died a hero's death at the hands, we think, of the Hyksos, because in the 1970s, analysis was carried out on the wounds this poor guy received, and the blades that were used to inflict these wounds are of Hyksos type. specifically Hyksos blade shapes, because this is at the beginning of the fight back against the Hyksos when the Thebans are still getting their head around this new military technology. It used to be thought that Seqenra had been killed in battle, but the wounds are predominantly around his head. There are very few wounds on his arms, for instance. And the most recent theory is that he was executed by the Hyksos after a military encounter. Seqenre was then taken prisoner, taken up to possibly the Hyksos capital of Aris, and they're executed in time-honoured Egyptian fashion, ironically, which is by grabbing the victim by the hair, of which Seqenre had a lot. He'd got thick, curly hair. And then the blade, traditionally a mace, but in this case, a mace, an axe, and possibly a scimitar, were brought down with great force on Seqenre's head. You can see the way the wounds caused obvious blood loss, the blood still matting the hair today. And it's a very moving sight to see this body of this great leader, a great Theban hero, still in those what can be called the throes of death, because clearly the poor man died in agony. He was also mummified, interestingly enough, so there's a suggestion that maybe the body was given back to the Thebans. However, clearly some time had elapsed between his killing and when the mummification process could begin, because putrefaction had certainly started. The body fat had certainly started to degrade to the extent that when Seqenre's body was discovered at the end of the 19th century, having been reburied down in Thebes, it was taken to Cairo Museum, put in a glass case with some of the other royal mummies. But in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when researchers started to x-ray the royal mummies, when that glass case was opened, the scent of decomposition was hugely powerful. So the poor guy is still decomposing. The fat in his soft tissue in his skin is still breaking down and releasing these volatile compounds. And so it's almost like you're revisiting a crime scene that's still going on now. The aftermath is still active, if you like, makes any sense, which is quite incredible. It shows the value of fragrance, of scent over time, because one of the things we see is fragrance and scent, not just the nice part, the perfumes that they were making, but the way when things degrade and break down, they can also information and give us a lot of evidence for various going back 3,000 years.
That's incredible.
Archaeological forensics is really fascinating. It's like a sort of scene from Morse where they can have the results by Tuesday or whatever it is.
Yeah, and that's usually the deadline that they give us as well. It's like, yeah, can you just look at this data and do it quick? Our research can literally take years because you're trying to look at a chemical fingerprint.
So you yourself are actually acting as a forensic scientist in these cases.
Yeah, I mean, it's my background is Egyptology, but because we have the lab here, and because for the last 25 years I've been studying physical to work with some brilliant scientists. And in 2011, we actually mummified a human body donor, and I was part of the team involved in that. And we did so with permission from the Home Office, Human Tissue Authority, some fantastic medical colleagues. And it was an amazing project that's still ongoing with our colleagues at Guy's, St Thomas's, and King's College in London, who were also part of our team, although the actual mummification was done up here in Yorkshire at Sheffield's Medico Legal Centre, again, colleagues who are pathologists. So that was an amazing learning curve for all of us. And what a privilege to be part of this project, which really did rewrite how the Egyptians were mummifying. We thought we had all the answers. We thought, oh yes, we know how the Egyptians mummified. No, we didn't. For the whole of the dynasty of Tutankhamun, the whole of the 18th dynasty, which whose existence was triggered by the death of Seqenenre, and how his surviving relatives coped, how they created the 18th dynasty after his death. That whole dynasty mummified in a completely revolutionary way, which we were able to understand and recreate in this same project. And that was simply by, well, say simply, basically by studying all the x-rays of all the royal mummies that were taken in the 1960s and 70s, doing our own work in the Valley of the Kings with digital x-ray equipment and pinpointing details in the scans and the x-rays helped us understand so much better a lot of the iconography, the artistic representations, some of the architectural features of funerary temples where we believe these elite Egyptians were embalmed and mummified at this time. A lot of it starts to make more sense when you get the big picture, if you like. So, from people just going, oh, mummies, oh, no, no. No, that's not the way to look at Egyptian mummified remains. The way to look at these individuals are as fabulously important individuals who played a key part in this wonderful culture and who are still helping us understand their world today if we interpret them correctly, treat them with the right level of respect, and fully engage with them. They're still here with us. They aren't a pile of bones like, my immediate ancestors going back 2 or 3 generations. We can scroll back multiple generations with the Egyptians and see them as they were in life. They have their hair, their nails, their facial features. And if we engage properly with them, we can actually understand them properly and tell their story. And I think that's a great thing. It's a great responsibility, but it's a great privilege to try and tap into all that. So I love my job. Let's just say that.
And you mentioned there about how Seqenenre's kind of descendants and family sort of set things up for the kind of the peak of King Tutankhamun, which in a sense, I think I hadn't realized this. In fact, most people won't realize this reading the book, but that is the story of River God, because Seqenenre leaves behind a widow who is possibly also his sister. And in fact, our fictional pharaoh Mimose also leaves behind a widow who is not his sister in River God, but is the Lady Lustrous. And in real life, the sister's called Ahotep. And you said that you were very keen on her.
Oh, amazing. When her body was found in the mid 19th century on the West Bank at Thebes, modern Luxor, it was an incredible discovery because her massive golden coffin, enormous coffin, one of the largest ever found in Egypt. The 2 biggest coffins ever found in Egypt were way, way bigger than those described. One was Ahotep's, the other was our daughter. And these massive coffins were a mark of their immense stature. They were hugely powerful, and our Hotep, her coffin didn't just include her mummified body, but her stupendous jewelry, beautiful jewelry, and a matching set of weapons, axes, daggers, exquisite things. And it's that duality of pretty, very delicate, very nice, but very lethal as well. So it's the same duality we have when we're looking at the goddess. They're beautiful, but they can kill you in a kind of brilliant sort of bringing together of how the Egyptians viewed male and female. And with our Hotep, we know that she continued the armed struggle. Once Seqenenre had been killed, we know from texts set up at Karnak Temple that she rallied the troops. She defended Egypt's borders. She continued with the war. It's all there in hieroglyphs. Traditional Egyptology does like its written evidence, its hieroglyphs, even though only around 1% of anybody could ever read and write back then, the very small literate elite. But the texts tell us this. Her burial equipment tells us this. She was a massive figure. And of course, um, the son, Ahotep and Seqenenre, they had 2 sons, it's believed. One's Kamosi, who again died in the armed struggle, and a younger son called Ahmosi, Ahmosi being the first king of the 18th dynasty. And it was Ahmosi's final push in pushing out the Hyksos once and for all, and pushing them right back up into their heartlands up in the Levant, that really created the Egyptian empire when it was at its greatest. He pushed them out and continued pushing until Egypt occupied that whole of the eastern Mediterranean seaboard as far north as the River Euphrates, up near, up in Syria. And they did the same down in Nubia, modern Sudan. They pushed and pushed and pushed until they created the greatest empire the world had then seen. I mean, these people didn't mess about. And of course, having all this land, this territory, this wealth, allowed them to plough that back into Egypt itself and to build places like Karnak, to equip bodies in the Valley of the Kings with so much gold, so much treasure, so much wealth. So it was this kind of the Hyksos period, this complete pivotal time for Egypt when it really did flower then into this mighty 18th dynasty, this so-called Golden Empire, which it literally was.
Oh, that's brilliant. And I think because Rob was telling the story forwards, as a reader of River God, you don't necessarily realize that all that is coming. So listening to you now, it's fantastic to realize that not only is this a great story in its own right, because clearly it's fictionalizing Second Ra, Ahotep, and Kamosi and Ahmosi, but that actually it is leading to this very dramatically kind of satisfying next step. And in fact, there's a character in the novel, the son of Ahotep is called Memnon, but when he becomes pharaoh, he takes the name Tamosi, which I have to think is Wilbur kind of playing a bit with Amosi and Kamosi. There's one bit of the book which I think, again, having read your history of the period, is maybe Wilbur taking a bit of artistic license. So in the novel, after they've been defeated by the by the Hyksos, they actually abandon. So Lostris, who's the sort of the Ahotep type character, abandons Thebes, and they go up the river, and they go right down through the Sudan all the way as far as modern day Khartoum, where the Blue Nile and the White Nile meet, and actually even further into Ethiopia. But I think that's maybe Wilbur kind of playing with the facts a bit, because is it right that they never actually abandoned Thebes?
They never really abandoned Thebes, but there's also evidence that the Thebans were sort of very close to their allies in a place called El Kab to the south of Egypt, close to where close to Aswan on the southern border of modern Egypt today. But we do know that the early 18th dynasty did travel far into the Sudan, what is modern Sudan today. They travelled extensively to the south via the Nile, which was very tricky because it's not easy to navigate after Aswan, because they're what called cataracts, which are these rocky outcrops in the middle of the Nile where you can't continue to sail. You have to haul the boat out, drag it along the sand, and put it back into the river and continue on your way. But we do know that Egyptian royals of the early 18th dynasty, Ahmosi and his immediate successors, in fact, in 3 generations afterwards, you reach the mighty Hatshepsut, one of the female pharaohs, and she made this journey with her father, Tutmosis I, far to the south, to these areas of modern Sudan, and left inscriptions on the rock, and very much influenced culture at that time. We know that they set up fortifications and so forth, and really did control this part of the extended Egyptian empire. So much of this part of Sudan was part of the Egyptian empire in the early 18th dynasty. When we were in Khartoum filming the last series at the museum there was some incredible stuff that had come from excavations in and around the northern Sudan, and Egypt left such a sort of indelible mark on the country. It's incredible building Egyptian-style temples. And ironically, then, in the fullness of time, the Sudanese rulers, by around 747 BC, actually invaded Egypt and did the same, but in reverse. So the Sudanese are controlling Egypt, and it's just a sort of, again, these two what are now separate countries today, sharing so much of each other's cultures, to the extent there are now more pyramids in the Sudan than were ever built in Egypt. So it's as if, where on earth does ancient Egyptian culture stop? It just goes on and on and on. And it was a fabulous privilege to be in Sudan and to see all these things. And with the tragic events that are happening at the time of recording now, all the violence in and around Khartoum and elsewhere, it breaks your heart. It's these lovely people that were so hospitable and wonderful when we were there, and how they're suffering now. It's interesting that I don't know what it is about the things we've studied over the last few years, but we've also been in Yemen a lot, studying, spending a lot of time there. Obviously, in the days before all the violence, because they had a mummy making culture that is very closely linked to the Egyptian, because they were trading with Egypt in the first millennium BC and possibly even earlier. And so, wherever there are points of interest, for some reason there are also these flashpoints of extreme violence. Um, it's it's often incredibly poignant, the places that we have colleagues we've worked with, wonderful colleagues, and then it's really sad to think, that they're going through all the things that they are going through at the moment.
Absolutely. In terms of Egypt, so at one time or another, Hyksos, Assyrians, Nubians, Greeks, Romans all come back, and it's a bit like sort of the Low Countries in Europe, where they're like about, or Poland, for example, which are the countries endlessly armies are sweeping across. So you have these cultures sweeping over Egypt, and yet somehow the identity of Egypt survives. So, what is the essential thing that is, as it were, the bit that survives even after Ptolemy's come in and, let's say, Caesar and what have you? How does Egypt stay Egypt?
Oh, that's very, very easy. That's basically because Egyptian culture and religion are so interlinked, and all foreign invaders could see that what they could bring to the table was nothing in comparison. What did the Greeks and Romans offer after death? Oh, you sink down into some miserable black hole in the ground, and it was all tragic and horrible. The Egyptians offered the promise of eternal life. All you needed to be is embalmed and mummified, and your soul could live forever. And a lot of these cultures thought, yeah, we can buy into that. The Greeks, the Ptolemies certainly did. They certainly did. Alexander the Great left orders to be mummified at death. He wanted to do this, to live in the next world in a way that the Egyptians were clearly fully believing in themselves. It was obviously their belief system, but it clearly was so impactful on all these so-called foreign invaders that they wanted a piece of that for themselves. Alexander did it. His Ptolemaic descendants did it. The Romans did it, not only in Egypt where they occupied, but also bringing this same practice back to their own heartlands, if you like. So you do find the practice of mummification and the worship of Egyptian gods in many parts of the Greek world. You certainly see it in Italy, not just in Rome, but around Italy itself. Of course, the wonderful thing for me is when Rome had conquered Egypt in 30 BC and then came to our sunny shores, 43 AD. The wonderful thing was there were Egyptians in the Roman army. They brought with them their traditional belief systems. As the Roman army then spread up through Britain as far as York, established the city of Iberacum, the practices came with them. So the most northerly temple ever built anywhere for the worship of the gods of Egypt was on the banks of the River Ouse here in Yorkshire, in York. They were even mummifying their dead.
Wow.
So I just find that mind blowing. I that finding that out was a wonderful thing, because you spend your life feeling very odd and wondering, why on earth have I been obsessed by this for so long? And when you realise that not really new, Joanne, this sort of thing's been happening in Yorkshire for 2,000 years. And to think they were worshipping Egyptian gods 2,000 years ago is a wonderful, wonderful, amazing thing. And I've done such a lot of work over the last 20, 30 years to look at the links between ancient Egypt and Yorkshire, which seem so very far apart, and yet they aren't. There are so many things that have been found that are inexplicable at first. It's like, well, what's this bronze statuette of goddess Isis doing here in Yorkshire? Oh, well, it's always assumed, oh, it must be some sort of a gentleman collector, an antiquarian who accidentally dropped it. Well, he's dropping a lot of stuff because there's a lot of stuff being found. It's actually often in context, dating back to Roman times, some 2,000 years ago, because this stuff's coming over from Egypt, a couple of millennia ago, and sort of being discovered in more modern times, because it came over as a practical part of a religious system that infiltrated so many people who went to Egypt, thought they'd conquered Egypt, but as I said in the last series, in fact, Egypt conquered them. And I think it still does. I think it's so profound, its effect on people, that it gets into your DNA, as it were.
Amazing. River God as a book was written kind of against the will of Wilbur Smith Publishers and then sold 10 million copies. And there's been, I know, 5, 6, 7 sequels. It's because it's something which just does fascinate people. And we were talking earlier about music and dance like an Egyptian. Okay, how did Egyptians dance and what did the music sound like?
Oh, their dancers are fabulous. It's I'm absolutely. I love to try and understand Egypt on a multi-sensory level, which sounds a bit poncy, but it's really, you can't just look at the ancient Egyptians to be able to recreate their perfumes. How did their world smell? How did it sound? And for me, that's an integral part of it, to try and understand ancient Egyptian music. We featured some wonderful Egyptian musicians on the last series. They research and study ancient Egyptian musical instruments, they've recreated them. We can plug in and hear how these things sounded. Um, and to just get an idea of this wonderful percussive sound, the beats of their music, and how dance steps would have worked. And what dance steps, you can see the tomb scenes, and the way that they show almost like a comic strip of, it isn't just like lots of multiple dancers, it's the same dancer doing a move, but in sort of freeze frame. You can see the backflips, you can see the way that the steps are performed. Even in Egyptian
Wow.
folk dancing today, there's this step that they do where they do this giant stride, this kind of stepping over from this world to the next. And you can see this, if you look carefully, in the tomb images, in the visual scenes that have survived, because people again like to think there's some sort of disconnect between ancient and modern Egypt, and there's no disconnect whatsoever. It's a continuum. And of course, Islam is very different to ancient Egyptian religion, but the Egyptians are the Egyptians. They're still there, and it's there's no cut-off point. So I've been in a privileged position of adopted by an Egyptian, a traditional Egyptian family on the West Bank at Luxor, and to sit at home in the corner of the house and just watch life go by is so fabulous. It's just taught me so much, and how people, families dance at home when, just interacting with each other as we all do in the sort of privacy of our own homes. And that's just been an amazing thing. And how there are sort of, we were saying earlier that the men and women lived side by side and all that. But today it's sort of when the men have gone out to work on a morning, and it's just us women and the kids in the house, and the radio goes on, and we all have a bit of a dance if we feel like it. I just love that, and it's that glimpse into this intimate world. It's lovely. I mean, obviously, then the bread might need baking, or the chickens might need looking after, but it's just this joyful, wonderful world that's usually hidden away, but you just get to see it and to share in it, and it's just fabulous. It's like looking at Egypt on multiple levels at the same time. So to see how Egyptians today are in so many ways very little different to their ancestors going back millennia is just it's just a wonderful thing.
And as you're talking about, different ways of bringing sort of ancient Egypt to life. Obviously, one of the ways is through fiction, and certainly, I think, obviously, for millions and millions of people, reading Wilbur's novels will have been maybe their kind of introduction, or certainly a very, very powerful, vividly imagined rendition of what Egypt might have been like. I'm curious, as an Egyptologist, as an archaeologist, as a historian, do you welcome that, or do you worry that if you get novelists coming in and kind of making stuff up, filling in the gaps, maybe getting things wrong, maybe tweaking history to suit the story they want to tell, that's going to be problematic?
I think in the short term it can sometimes be problematic because I do a lot of talks all over the place, and quite often, if people have read a novel and in their mind they think, "Oh well, I know I've read it somewhere that the Egyptians did this, this, and this." It can depend on the novel. The bigger picture is that, look, does this bring people into the world of ancient Egypt? Does it make them want to know more? Does it make them want to read fact books? Does it make them want to maybe visit their local museum? Does it make them want to go on holiday to Egypt? And the answer is quite often yes. So bring it on. I just think that's a wonderful thing. It's a culture that should be more widely appreciated and understood. And if it's a means by which people can engage in a sort of an interest in engaging where that's great, because let's face it, a lot of fact based books can be dry as dust. Plow through them, but if they've read a fascinating novel and thought, wow, this is pretty good, I wonder if they really did that, and then they go out and read up, or watch documentaries or whatever. I think, to be honest, the more the merrier.
Or listen to podcasts.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And for me, anybody talking about ancient Egypt can only be a good thing.
You were mentioning earlier, right at the very beginning, that there's that as it were, that Egypt stretches all the way from an African south in Upper Egypt to a Mediterranean Levantine north in Lower Egypt. And then, of course, you then have, I suppose, the Greek influence when the Ptolemies come in. So there's been a huge fuss over what Cleopatra did or did not look like, and how she should or should not be represented. So look, she was 2,000 years ago. So, but who was she in terms of her culture, and presumably therefore of her appearance, and how would you have described Cleopatra?
Cleopatra the Great. I go into this at some length because it's a chunky old book, and I spent 5 years of my life writing it, but I've been researching the great woman for many years. Obviously, part of the Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from the first Ptolemy, who was a general of Alexander the Great, who the records describe as, but he had fair hair, palish, tously hair, hanging down to his shoulders. A lot of descriptions of Alexander. Ptolemy was his general, but there's good evidence he was his likely half brother. They shared the same father, Philip of Macedon. When it comes to Cleopatra herself, she was born in Egypt. Egypt's in Africa, therefore she is African. Her family are Macedonian Greek. Her father's Macedonian Greek. Some of the Ptolemies, certainly Ptolemy II and his sister wife Arsinoe II, are described again in contemporary poetry as having blonde hair. That's just in the literature. The thing about Cleopatra is, however, we know her father was Ptolemy XII, Macedonian Greek by descent. We don't know who Cleopatra's mother was for sure, and we don't know who her grandmother was for sure. Now, this is largely because the Romans, history is rewritten by the victors, and Augustus, who apparently defeated Cleopatra, had all documents shredded, had all evidence removed, had inscriptions carved out, making it very difficult for us to reconstruct who exactly Cleopatra was and what she actually did. So, as a historian, I had to consult Greek, Latin, Egyptian sources and multiple source materials. But the fact we don't know who her mother was or her grandmother makes you wonder who these women were. It's also very telling that Cleopatra was the first of 300 years of Ptolemy's ruling Egypt to understand and speak and be able to communicate in Egyptian. All the others had spoken Greek, not Cleopatra. She was proficient in 7 or 8 languages. Her everyday Greek, even her handwriting survived. That was only discovered about 20 years ago. We have the great woman's handwriting. As I said, Greek for her everyday language, but she could converse with her Egyptian subjects in their own language. How did she know that? Was it something that she wanted to learn herself? Quite possibly. Did she learn it from her mother and her grandmother, who could well have been Egyptians? So, the jury's out. All I would say is, for me, as a redhead, fascinating image from Herculaneum, of all places, showing a portrait that many of us believe to be the great woman, and she has red hair. So what's not to love, whether this dyed hair, whether this was natural. It's an interesting one. PhD actually was on the subject of hair in ancient Egypt. So clearly I'm drawn to this subject hugely. But I think the way that Cleopatra is portrayed, again, we've been talking about the polarization. What is ancient Egypt? It's African, yes. But there's also influences from the Levant and the Mediterranean, clearly. It's the same with Cleopatra. We all want her to be like us. So, speaking as a woman born and bred in Barnsley in Yorkshire, there's always been a standing joke that I wouldn't be happy until I proved Cleopatra actually came from Barnsley. So, wasn't it wonderful when a few years ago, we were working on a Roman coin hoard found just outside Barnsley at a wonderful place called Darfield. And the very first silver coins I looked at were silver coins minted by Mark Antony and his Egyptian wife, Cleopatra.
Oh, wow.
And the coins themselves show that Cleopatra herself paid for the 500 warships that fought at the Battle of Actium, where Cleopatra herself was physically present with Mark Antony. So I'm not saying that we had the last laugh, but I'm getting closer to proving that she probably did come from Barnsley, actually.
Or maybe fled to Barnsley after she'd been defeated in Egypt, the lost years.
I'm sure there's a novel in that one, yeah.
The Barnsley Cleopatra sounds like a title of a novel in itself.
Actually, it was a Radio Times title with the last series. It said Barnsley's Cleopatra, so in reference to the series. So that made me chortle quite a bit.
There you go.
I think it sounds a bit like a nightclub. But
Yeah, I'd
yeah.
go.
Cleopatra, so it would be, yes. Well, can I just say, by the as the child of a redhead mother, whose maternal line were all blonde and redheaded Nordic people, if Cleopatra's a redhead, rock on, keep going.
Totally.
And of course, in the novel, Tanis is described as having kind of reddish hair, isn't he? Tanis, the hero, the sort of the military
Yes,
genius.
yes.
Something integral to the Hyksos is that the Egyptians often portrayed people from the Levant, from the Eastern Mediterranean seaboard area, with red hair. And they made a great play of that. And it's interesting that the male god that the Hyksos worshipped in Egypt, they worshipped Egyptian gods like the sun god Ra, but they also worshipped their own version of Baal, the Middle Eastern god of storms, who in Egypt is Seth. And Seth in Egyptian mythology is traditionally shown with red hair.
Yes.
And after the Hyksos period had ended, the Egyptians who took over would always refer to turbulent people. I'm not saying trouble causers, but people who were quite volatile and turbulent as the red-headed forms, the followers of Seth. And that was fair enough until the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, Ramses II and his father Seti, took power after the fall of the House of Tutankhamun. They took power, and lo and behold, they were redheads. And so, isn't it interesting that Seth, this turbulent god, this red creature, was suddenly rehabilitated within the Egyptian pantheon? He was suddenly seen as one of the good guys. Oh, yes, he's a defender of the sun god. We've loved Seth all along. And certainly, we've got Ramses II as an older pharaoh when the red hair of his youth was fading, actually using henna. Tests have been done on his hair, and his hairdressers were actually augmenting the colour with red henna dye, just to sort of keep his trademark red hair going. And again, it's this little window into this world of this aging pharaoh. You see him sat there with his hairdressers, putting the dye on, touching up his roots. Love it, absolutely love it.
I have to say, I also was born a redhead, and like Ramses II, my red hair is now fading. But I think my mother would certainly recognise why the stormy, tumultuous, violent god might indeed be portrayed as a redhead.
Yeah, and also within Egyptian society, where the vast majority had dark hair, very dark hair,
Yeah,
the flash of a red-headed person would have been, quite striking, quite unusual. So hair color in ancient Egypt's another. It can be a political hot potato, but they were there, and they're in the text. They're in the physical sort of body of evidence that we have. So
yeah, it's amazing. I think maybe we should, on that note, maybe we should give the last word to Wilbur, which, in fact, in his last words in River God, in his author's notes, he says, "I'm left with a realization of how little the emotions and aspirations of man have changed in all that time since the ancient Egypt period." And I think what you've done wonderfully for us today, Joe, is to just really put flesh on those bones and just show us how everything from the nature of redheads through the makeup, the aspirations of people, the way they lived. Obviously, things change, but an awful lot of things stay the same. So, thank you so much for joining us and for filling in that history.
Yes, thank you so much, Joann.
it's been an absolute pleasure. I've loved talking about this. So thank you for inviting me.
There are lots more Egyptian books in the canon, so come back soon because we have more Egypt to talk about.
Oh, I'd love to.
Brilliant.
You only have to invite me, and I'll be there.
Excellent. Excellent.
And also, of course, we're both in Yorkshire, which I shall now, and I'm in York, which I shall now forever think of as the Thebes of England.
For sure.
Cleopatra is a Barnsley lass. I think that's the takeaway from this episode.
Only in your world, but it makes me smile.
Fantastic. And if you have been as informed and entertained as Diana and I have both been by Joe's incredible knowledge of ancient Egypt, then do go and check out her website, which is immortalegypt, all one word, .co.uk. That's immortalegypt.co.uk, where you can find all about her books, her YouTube channel, and many other things that she is up to. So do please join us again next time, when we'll be taking a look at one of the books that Wilbur co-wrote with my co-host, Diana Thomas, under her nom de guerre of David Churchill, Courtney's War, and in particular the Battle of Stalingrad, with its disturbing similarities to today's war in Ukraine.
So on that note, it is goodbye from me, Tom Harper.
And it's goodbye from me, Diana Thomas. That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Wynne.
Music by Dewey DeLay.